Oregon looks like the most progressive state in America, until you learn that 13 of its counties have voted to leave, not symbolically, actually redraw the border and join Idaho. And here's what makes it strange. This is the third time in 80 years the part of Oregon has tried to secede. Most states become more unified over time. Oregon is actively fracturing. The reason starts with a single mountain range that split the state into two incompatible worlds, and a governance system that gave all the power to one side. The Cascade Range runs north to south through the heart of the state like a 260-mile wall. Pacific air carrying moisture from the ocean slams into these peaks and has nowhere to go but up. As it rises, it cools. As it cools, it dumps rain, 50 to 100 inches per year on the western slopes. That's the Oregon of postcards and tourism campaigns. Temperate rainforest where moss drapes every surface in carpets of green, where Douglas firs tower 200 feet into perpetual mist, where ferns grow wild along roads that wind through valleys so lush they feel prehistoric. Stand in Portland after a winter storm and you might go weeks without seeing direct sunlight. The gray settles in like a permanent guest. Rivers run high and fast. The air smells like wet earth and pine needles. But once that Pacific air crosses the summit and begins to descend, everything changes. The moisture is gone, wrung out on the western slopes like water from a sponge. The air dries out completely. Eastern Oregon receives fewer than 10 inches of rain per year, less than parts of Nevada. Trees vanish almost immediately. Sagebrush stretches to every horizon. The sky opens up vast, cloudless, and brutal. Summers bring triple-digit heat. Winters bring bitter cold and winds that howl across empty basins with nothing to stop them. You can drive from rainforest to high desert in under 3 hours. This isn't a climate curiosity or a fun fact for trivia night. It's an ecological, economic, and political chasm that no other state boundary in America so cleanly bisects. The Cascades didn't just create different weather patterns, they created different worlds. And those worlds developed completely different economies, completely different cultures, and completely different ideas about what Oregon should be. But here's the problem: only one of those worlds gets to govern. Western Oregon centers on Portland and the Willamette Valley. 60% of the state's population is packed into one metropolitan area: progressive, tech-driven, home to Nike's global headquarters and Intel's semiconductor plants. The Pearl District's craft breweries. Wine country 30 minutes from downtown. This is the Oregon that shows up in national conversations. Eastern Oregon is the opposite world. It comprises 65% of the state's land, but only 9% of its people. Ranches where cell service vanishes for hours at a stretch. Timber towns that haven't recovered from the 1990s. Counties larger than Delaware with populations smaller than a single Portland neighborhood. Malheur County alone spans more than 9,900 square miles and has fewer than 30,000 residents. When Portland votes, it decides for the entire state. A 30-point gap separates Portland from Eastern Oregon in presidential elections. In 2020, Portland voted 69% for Biden. Some Eastern Oregon counties went 65% or more for Trump. These aren't close elections that could swing either way. They're landslides in opposite directions happening in the same state. Eastern Oregon will lose every statewide election, forever. The math is permanent. No amount of organizing or enthusiasm can overcome that population imbalance. And the people living on the losing side of that equation know it. If you want to understand how geography shapes where Americans live and why, subscribe. This tension didn't start recently. It exploded 80 years ago with pistols and roadblocks. November 27, 1941. Miners and loggers with pistols buckled onto their belts barricaded U.S. Route 99 near Eureka, California, right at the Oregon border. They stopped traffic heading north and south. They handed out pamphlets declaring independence. The grievances were real, even if the rebellion was theatrical. Rural communities along the California-Oregon border had begged their state governments for years to build better roads through the mountains. Timber needed to reach markets. Miners needed supplies. But Sacramento and Salem kept the money for projects closer to the coast, closer to the cities where the votes lived. The rural counties paid taxes but saw nothing in return. Sound familiar? The pamphlets read, "You are now entering Jefferson, the 49th state of the Union. Jefferson is now in patriotic rebellion against the states of California and Oregon. Patriotic Jeffersonians intend to secede each Thursday until further notice." The rebels demanded tolls from passing drivers. A judge named John Childs was elected governor of this phantom state and celebrated his victory next to a pet bear named Itchy. The mayor of Port Orford, a former radio personality named Gilbert Gable, styled himself the Hick Mayor of the westernmost United States and orchestrated the whole thing as equal parts publicity stunt and genuine grievance. For weeks, it worked. National newsreel cameras recorded ceremonies on the Siskiyou County Courthouse steps. A San Francisco Chronicle reporter named Stanton Delaplane won a Pulitzer Prize covering the Eureka Rebellion. The Eureka Brewing Company bottled Jefferson beer. Local businesses printed "State of Jefferson" signs. Momentum was building towards something that felt almost real. Then came December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. Within 24 hours, the rebels publicly pledged their loyalty to the war effort. The state of Jefferson dissolved overnight into historical footnote, a dress rehearsal for conflicts that would return. The grievances didn't disappear with the roadblocks. They just went dormant, waiting for the next spark. 50 years later, that spark arrived, in the form of a small bird with spotted feathers. In 1990, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service listed the northern spotted owl as a threatened species. The owl's survival required protecting old-growth forest habitat across Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. Federal regulators designated 6.9 million acres as critical habitat. Logging was prohibited across vast stretches of eastern Oregon's timber-dependent economy. The impact was severe. Between 28,000 and 32,000 jobs vanished, a 28% decline nationally in timber employment. That number was far below the industry's dire predictions of 130,000 job losses. But statistics meant nothing to the small towns where the sawmill was the only employer. These weren't Portland layoffs where workers could pivot to tech or services. These were communities where the mill was everything: the tax base, the identity, the future. When the mill closed, everything closed with it. In towns like Mill City and Sweet Home, the closure played out in slow motion. First, the mill whistle stopped blowing. Then the hardware store cut its hours. Then the grocery store started stocking less. Young families packed up for Portland or Eugene, anywhere with jobs. The churches that once held 2 Sunday services dropped to 1. Then none. Main streets boarded up. Schools consolidated or shuttered entirely for lack of students. Houses that families had owned for 3 generations sold for a fraction of what they were worth a decade earlier, if they sold at all. The towns that remained became shells of what they had been, inhabited mostly by those too old to start over or too poor to leave. Rural Oregon watched Portland politicians and environmental groups from the Willamette Valley, people they saw as out-of-touch urbanites who never logged a tree or worked a shift at a mill, dictate the fate of their communities via federal law. Washington, D.C. decided rural communities paid the price. The spotted owl became a symbol of something larger. Eastern Oregon sacrificed for Western Oregon's environmental values. That resentment crystallized into permanent political identity. Eastern Oregon shifted from swing region to reliably Republican stronghold, voting against every statewide measure supported by Portland, not always because of the policy, but because of who was proposing it. The wound from 1990 never healed. It just waited for the right moment to reopen. By the 2020s, Eastern Oregon stopped asking to be heard. They asked to leave. The Greater Idaho movement launched in 2021 with a simple pitch: move the Oregon-Idaho border westward. Transfer conservative rural counties to a state that shares their values. Let each half go its separate way in peace. The strategy is audacious but legally possible. It requires no new laws to be passed, only local ballot approvals in each county, followed by negotiations between the Oregon and Idaho legislatures, then congressional approval. Difficult, but not impossible. The Constitution allows state boundaries to change with the consent of the states involved in Congress. It's happened before. West Virginia was carved from Virginia during the Civil War. The mechanism exists. As of 2024, 13 of Oregon's 36 counties have voted in favor. These aren't close calls decided by a few hundred ballots. They're decisive majorities ranging from 55 to 65% choosing to leave. In some counties, the margins were overwhelming. Voters who had watched their communities decline for 30 years, who felt ignored by Salem and dismissed by Portland, finally had something concrete to vote for. Mike McCarter, the movement's leader and a retired prior cop from Lapine, framed it plainly. We call on the legislature to let each half of the state go their separate ways in peace. If Western Oregon doesn't like the risk of being forced to accept the gubernatorial candidate it voted against, then it should simply stop holding our counties captive in this unhappy marriage. Idaho's legislature is listening. In February 2023, they passed their own measure to begin formal discussions with Oregon about the border change. If it succeeds, the consequences reshape the American map. It would be the first state boundary redrawn since the Civil War era. Oregon would shrink to a coastal and Willamette Valley state, tech, wine, environmental policy. Idaho would become a sprawling three-region superstate, the nation's third largest by area. And the precedent could trigger similar movements across the country. Rural Colorado, upstate New York, eastern Washington, the state of Jefferson finally rising from its 1941 ashes. But while Oregon fractures politically, it's also a state of bizarre regulatory paradoxes that make it unlike anywhere else in America. Oregon banned self-serve gas for 72 years, longer than most states have existed. From 1951 until August 2023, pumping your own fuel was illegal. Fire safety, they claimed. Job protection. The law became part of Oregon's identity, a quirk that residents defended fiercely even as the rest of the country found it absurd. Visitors from California or Washington would pull into gas stations and sit confused in their cars until an attendant appeared. Some Oregonians genuinely didn't know how to operate a gas pump. When Governor Tina Kotek finally signed the bill allowing self-serve, it sparked outrage among residents who saw it as the end of an era. Oregon became the last state in the nation to permit it. New Jersey still hasn't caught up. But Oregon was also first in the opposite direction. In 1971, Oregon created the nation's first bottle deposit law. Bottles made up 40% of highway litter at the time. By 1973, that dropped to 10%. By 1979, just 6%. The law was so effective it's been expanded twice. As of July 2025, even canned wine is redeemable. Oregon pioneered the environmental policy that dozens of states eventually copied. Oregon has no sales tax, one of only 5 states in the country, but it compensates with the nation's highest personal income tax rate, up to 9.9%. The structure makes Oregon a magnet for high-ticket retail purchases. Californians drive north to buy cars and furniture without paying sales tax. But it punishes middle-class residents who pay the difference every April 15th. The same state that pioneered environmental protection in the 1970s with the first urban growth boundaries, requiring every city to define growth limits and protect farmland from sprawl, now ranks near last nationally in renewable energy development. Why? Because the permitting process designed to stop nuclear plants in the 1970s now blocks wind and solar projects in the 2020s. And one person embodies that contradiction perfectly. Irene Gilbert is a retired state employee and former gun store owner from La Grande, deep in eastern Oregon. She's 76 years old, and she's filed 15 legal challenges to wind, solar, and nuclear projects across the state. Her weapon? Oregon's Energy Facility Siting Council, a permitting process created in the 1970s by progressives to stop nuclear power plants. The law requires extensive environmental review, public comment periods, and legal challenge windows for any major energy project. It worked exactly as intended. Oregon never built a single nuclear plant. But now that same process blocks renewable energy. Every wind farm, every solar installation, every project that could help Oregon meet its climate goals has to navigate the same bureaucratic maze. Irene Gilbert figured out how to weaponize it. She files challenges, demands reviews, and drags out timelines until projects become economically unviable. Oregon ranks near last in the nation for clean energy growth, not because of conservative opposition, but because of liberal legal architecture designed for a fight that ended decades ago. It's Oregon in miniature. Progressive policy from 50 years ago colliding with progressive goals today. Institutions built for one battle becoming obstacles in another. A state so divided it can't even agree on what it's divided about. Oregon's divisions have become a model for studying American polarization. Academics use it as a case study for urban-rural conflict. Dense liberal cities voting one way, dispersed rural areas voting another, with no common ground and no obvious path to compromise. Governor Tina Kotek acknowledged the reality. I think there are a lot of Oregonians who are frustrated and don't feel heard. That, I think, is what the movement is about. If Greater Idaho succeeds, the American map changes. Oregon shrinks to a coastal and valley state. Idaho becomes massive. Congress has to approve a border change for the first time in over 150 years. And the precedent encourages every other divided state to try the same thing. If Greater Idaho fails, Eastern Oregon remains captive to a distant metropolitan hub, watching power concentrate in a city most of its residents have never visited, losing every statewide election by permanent mathematical guarantee. Either way, Oregon proves something uncomfortable about America. State boundaries drawn by 19th century mapmakers don't map onto the realities of 21st century life. The Cascades didn't care about political convenience when they created two incompatible worlds, and the people living in those worlds are finally demanding a choice. Oregon isn't one state. It's two incompatible regions forced into the same boundary by mapmakers who never imagined what those regions would become. The mountain wall decided their climates. The rain shadow decided their economies. And the governance structure decided their politics, giving one side permanent power and the other side permanent resentment. 3 times in 80 years, part of Oregon has tried to leave. The first attempt ended with Pearl Harbor. The second attempt ended with a protected owl. The third attempt is still on the ballot. The question isn't whether Oregon can stay unified. The question is whether any state this divided ever could. If you want to see how geography shaped another American state, check out one of these videos. And if you're not subscribed yet, now's the time.